Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this meeting of the ABGRD. It's a great pleasure for me this afternoon to be able to introduce Apostolos Dοξιάδη. On the posters as author, but he's a lot more than an author. He's also a mathematician, a logician, a cognitive scientist, a filmmaker, a playwright, but is known perhaps above all for his novels, and particularly the novel Ο Θείος Πέτρος και η Οικεσία του Goldbach, Uncle Petros and Goldbach's Conjecture, which was a bestseller and is translated into many languages, and above all illustrates his special talent for bringing together imagination, mathematics, narrative, and science. So it's a great pleasure to introduce him this afternoon with the subject of the tyranny of Greece over Greece. So Apostolos Dοξιάδης, welcome.
I don't think of a greater honor than having you introduce me here, and thank you also, Fiona. Thank you very much, and Claire for inviting me and for hosting this event. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Aristotle writes in the Rhetoric that a speaker must convince partly by appeal to his authority on the subject, what he calls the ethos argument. Now, I don't know about authority. I'm a writer. Scholars are judged by the correctness of their facts and the solidity of their arguments, or should be anyway. Us writers take refuge in the much more humane criterion of se non è vero e ben trovato. Or, as Jerome Bruner wrote, a theoretical argument should be true, while a story should be gripping, even if not true. Now, this of course is terrible advice to a scholar, just make it gripping. But it puts a writer in a somewhat advantageous position when the subject is mentalities, mentalité, Jacques Le Goff would say. For mentalities are often shaped, as the recent Greek crisis has shown us only too well, more by gripping drama than the starkness of factual truth. Also, needless to say, I'm Greek, not necessarily an advantageous quality nowadays. But I feel that it allows me greater license to say things about Greece that might be less palatable coming from an outsider. Personal experience was, of course, not a sufficient condition for talking sense, but in certain matters, it's a necessary one. So, I offer you my lecture today, part storytelling, part personal essay. My title is inspired by a book published in 1935. Its author was a British scholar of German literature, quite ambivalent in her feelings towards the people whose culture she studied. She wrote her book, The Tyranny of Greece over Germany, at a time when many people, Germans and non-Germans alike, were losing their faith in Germany. Most blamed this on its new leader, Herr Hitler. But Butler, perhaps in the grip of the darker side of her feelings for the country, saw political developments as the result of a canker working its way to the heart of the German spirit. Quite originally, she blamed it all on Greece. Now, a metaphor is worth 1,000,000 words and more maybe. A metaphor is often invaluable as a central, organizing principle in our perception of a complex subject. But a metaphor is never as effective as when it is enshrined in a title. Indeed. How powerful would be our memory of a book called, as its author initially intended, Among Ash Heaps and Millionaires? Would the book have become central to a nation's self-image if the author gave it instead his other candidate for a title, Trimalchio at West Egg? Great as the novel that those titles were tried out for is, its influence is part and parcel of its actual title, The Great Gatsby. Or take the great modern poem, whose title was originally intended by the poet to be, He knew the police in different voices. Would it still be read as a metaphor for a whole age if the poet hadn't changed his mind and named it instead The Wasteland? Similarly, I doubt that we remember very often a book from the 1930s whose title was along the lines of its pedantic subtitle. A study of the influence exercised by Greek art and poetry over the great German writers of the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries, instead of the tyranny of Greece over Germany. Now, my lecture would also profit from a pedantic subtitle, slightly longer perhaps, the study of the influence exercised by the idea of ancient Greece over Greek and non-Greek writers and intellectuals, as well as many others in the 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, and the way this influence has affected the perception of modern Greece. The range it refers to deserves more than a mere lecture. Still, the main thrust of my argument is contained in the metaphor of tyranny. But why speak of this today? Back to Aristotle. Nothing determines the core of a speech as does kairos, the moment, or, in a more modern expression, the timing. Of course, modern Greece is nowhere as important for the world at this moment as Germany was when Butler wrote her book. Still, the more attentive among you may have caught a mention of it in the news in the past few years. And you will have noticed that many of those mentions are enmeshed in a bundle of ready-made associations. Cognitive scientists might call these cultural scripts. The common thread running through them is in the past. They're talking about the crisis, but they're talking in those terms. Commenting on the crisis, cartoonists refer to the past again and again. And not just the cartoonists. Even economic analysts are often use ancient molds in which to pour their modern troubles. Of course, to most non-Greeks, the Greek crisis is about money and politics, the ancient stories being just window dressing. But to people who know more about Greece, the crisis is also very much about mentalities. And mentalities have very much to do with the past. During the crisis, in fact, Greece's relationship to the past entered public discourse in ways that people of my generation had not experienced since our teens. In the announcement for this lecture, I called this a disquieting revenant, this return. One of the reasons, of course, is that the neo-Nazi party, Golden Dawn, makes frequent reference to ancient roots. Here, some of its members commemorating celebrating the memory of Leonidas at Thermopylae. But it's not just them. A particular brand of archaeolatry is central to the discourse of all right-wing populist discourse. Here, for example, is our Minister of Defense, our present Minister of Defense, bound before the waters of Salamis in an event he organized commemorating the battle. Such things could be seen as innocuous. After all, exaggeration is a trademark of state feasts the world over. But they're not, as they go hand in hand with the rise of a xenophobic spirit, anti-European and anti-Western, that has spread over large segments of the Greek people. So, how did we get here? Okay, everybody knows the early part of the story, or rather everybody in this room. Well, perhaps almost everybody. So I'll give you a very cursory, simplified version. We must remember in this that the mirror view, that is how Greeks see themselves, often has direct analogies with the camera view, how they are seen by others, and so the two interrelate and offer stand for one another. And in that sense, we would start the story with Lord Byron, the best known embodiment of camera view outside looking in Philhellenism. His Isles of Greece expresses the central idea more beautifully than they can. The mountains look on Marathon, and Marathon looks on the sea. I'm musing there, an hour alone, I dreamed that Greece might still be free. Operative word here is, of course, still. The huge implication behind it is that the Greece of Homer, Sophocles, Plato, and the Battle of Marathon is the same Greece which some idealistic dreamers from the West were so keen to liberate. The West hailed the emergence of the modern Greek state as a reunion of the old and the new, and even today there are people in the West, God bless them, whose stance towards modern Greece is fueled by love of the Greek past. Philhellenism, a camera view, was at the start of the dominant mirror view, the new state as an incarnation of ancient Greece. But there were also other ideas about the new Greece, each one with its own view of the world. The hard facts are, of course, that something ancient Greece did exist in the past and that something modern Greece appeared in the 1820s, a new state. Then the rest are mental facts, and that a series of versions of the old could be seen growing in the shadow, the modern, cast a shadow, of course, on the old, and a series of ideas about the old could be seen as within that shadow. Oops, there's a poisonous mushroom there. Okay. Now, some of those mushrooms began to live their lives, some in noisier fashion, some in more quiet one, some interrupted, some intermittent, some going off to meet the courses of the lives of other mushrooms, the lives of some splitting in two or more and going their own way. A history of the tyranny of Greece over Greece is the history of the lives of the various mushrooms, or, if you allow me to go back to my previous metaphor, the distorting mirrors in which modern Greece sees itself. In each case, the physical force causing the distortion is a certain idea of the old, the ancient. Before we take a look at the differences between those mirrors, it makes sense to refer to an underlying similarity of all of them. I return briefly to Butler's book. In its chapters dedicated to various poets and writers, there appear again and again certain motifs. This combination of tyranny, ideal, passion, beauty, and the absolute are best encapsulated in one word: eros. The poets and artists Butler studies are all love-struck by Greece. They are tyrannized by a dark eros, a figure that could well belong in a nightmare. Equivalently, I propose, without claim to staggering originality, that the central theme in the tyranny of Greece over Greece can be extracted from the oft-phrased "οι αρχαίοι ημών πρόγονοι," our ancient ancestors. In one word, genos, the root word of genetics. Like eros in the case of Butler's book, genos provides a template from which we can build a whole dictionary of terms referring to our subject. To create it, we only have to ask one question. If modern Greeks are in familial relationship to the ancient, and I stress that by are, I mean perceive themselves to be, what is this relationship? What form of degree and family tie? Again, I'm not speaking biological relationships here, but relationships perceived, or perhaps to paraphrase Benedict Anderson, imagined relationships. Each term in our dictionary of relations, each imagined relationship, is determined by one answer to the question of what form and degree of familial relationship exists. Okay, so imagine relationship one, the grandfather, or in Freudian terms, the motherly grandfather, the motherly father, the caring father, the tender father. In 1858, a book by the title of Yeros Stathis, Old Stathis, was published. It was written by a lawyer and politician, Leon Melas, a man born and educated outside Greece, who returned to Greece in his 30s. Yeros Stathis records the conversations of a fictional elderly gentleman with the young people of a small village in Epirus. In these, he instructs them with tales of wisdom, mostly garnered from the ancients, Plato, Aristotle, and, very heavily, Xenophon, Plutarch, and Stobaeus. In Yeros Stathis, ancient Greece comes through in the form of the kindly grandfather. The essence of this relationship, of modern to ancient, is discipleship. The new is the disciple of the old. By this, the new Greece is an asymmetrical relation to the old, pupil to teacher. This relationship had great appeal at the time, judging from the fact that Yeros Stathis sold an extraordinary 300,000 copies. The second imagined relationship is that of motherhood. We see here Mother Hellas, it's also on my poster, as imagined by the cartoonist, 19th century cartoonist Panagiotis Pigadiotis. Of course, the image of motherland as an archaically clad, robust maiden is the visual topos of Western romantic patriotism. Similar images of Britannia and La France come to mind. Yet to a Greek, a Hellas in Hellenic attire takes on special significance, exuding a half-familial, half-erotic aura in good Oedipal tradition. The essence of this relationship is nurturance. But unlike the grandfatherly nurturance of Hierostathis, a nurturance of the mind, a spiritual one, intellectual, motherly nurturance is bodily, material, and that's fragile. To see this fragility, we only need to turn to the times when Mother Hellas fails to provide. Here is Mama Ελλάς, a stock character of the great 20th century cartoonist Bost, with her constantly hungry son Pinaleon. Bost, a leftist working in the post-Civil War 50s and 60s, expressed in his art his side's strong dissatisfaction with the existing status quo. The sorry state of the symbols, look at the helmet, the spear, the meander on her garment, makes the point clearly. If ancient glory can't feed you, what good is it? The third form of imagined relationship is the one that requires most imagination. Hierostathis points at ancient ideals to be achieved through industrious apprenticeship. But when the old is offered as a direct model, in all its grandeurs, to be imitated as such, it is bound to lead to failure, disappointment, and frustration. And so, in fact, I know of only one case in the history of the modern Greek state when there was a realistic perception that the ancient ideal had been realized. Those months, early in World War II, when Greece successfully repelled the fascist invasion. The proof of the realism of this perception was that the mirror view, inside looking in view, coincided with the camera view, the outside looking in. In Western eyes, the loftiest dreams of the Philhellenes were now vindicated. Byron would have been so proud of the country he struggled to liberate. The period is, without any serious contestants for the title, the only instance of modern Greece's acknowledged, successful, internationally acknowledged emulation of its old prototype. It is seen as such, its finest art, the dream come true. But like all dreams, alas, this one too was fleeting. Until now, I've been staying with a simple, basic story. By my mushroom analogy, though, I've only been talking of the nice, edible varieties, the morille, if you want, the chancherelle. We need more background to introduce the rest. Now, if I was addressing an audience in Greece, the Greece rather of the time when I was growing up, the next slide should be greeted with murmurs and whispers. Jakob Philipp Falmereyer, Tyrolean traveler, philologist, antiquarian, self-taught historian, who wrote in the 1830s a couple of books in which he set out to prove his thesis, highly original at the time, that the citizens of the new Greek state were not, I repeat, not the biological descendants of the glorious ancient Greeks. This is not the occasion, of course, to debate whether it's true or not, or whether it's important or not. What is important for our topic is that Falmereyer dared to speak a forbidden thought, one which, by the standards of romantic idealism, amounted to sacrilege. Like Philhellenism, Falmereyer's thesis survives today. In fact, during the recent crisis, it has won much more publicity and perhaps more credence than the thesis it refutes, the Byronic thesis. Here is a modern instance with the authority of the Frankfurter Allgemeine, no less. What does it mean to be Greek, the writer asks, and proceeds to answer, the Greeks are not the descendants of the Greek. This is a historical fact. Please note this, and so we have no questions. Anyway, the publication of Falmereyer's theories in the 1830s made a much bigger splash in Greece than in Europe. It unleashed a long-lasting storm, so long-lasting that even I, who was born 120 years after the publication of those theories, have a strong emotional memory of their denial by my primary school teacher when he mentioned the snarl with which he pronounced Falmereyer. He is still with me. It's like a Proustian Madeleine gone bad. But there was an important unintended consequence. Falmereyer's theories were the basic impetus for the development of Greek historiography. Like Falmereyer, Konstantinos Paparigopoulos lacked a university degree. Like him, he had considerable talents. His first book was defensive, an answer to Falmeriah's theories on the habitation of the Peloponnese by certain Slav races. His opus magnum, though, reminds us of the importance of titles. For nothing is more important than the title in Paparigopoulos' History of the Hellenic Nation, and the implication behind it, which is that such a history of the Greek nation, which had been born 30 years earlier, for 20 years earlier, is worth 5 volumes of prose. Now, the Philhellenic narrative, camera view and mirror view, outside looking in and inside looking in, saw the War of Independence as a struggle of a people to regain the freedom which existed in its antecedent state, ancient Greece, or perhaps I should call it classical Greece. The problem with this narrative, of course, is that it left 22 centuries unaccounted for, historiographically speaking, rather an embarrassment. A new story had emerged in the 18th century to account for this. Korais and Neroulos, two of the central figures of Greek Enlightenment, saw the Battle of Chaeronea, 338 BC, as the landmark. In it, the Hellenes were vanquished by the Macedonians, a phrasing which would disconcert many of today's Greek ultra-patriots. Then came the Roman conquerors, then the Byzantine, of which a Gibbonian view prevailed as barbaric and degenerate race, then the Ottoman. First there is Hellas, then there is no Hellas, then there is, resuscitated by the kiss of the fighters for independence. Paparigopoulos' history gave an end to this historical discontinuity. Thus, but once the B word, Byzantium, had been acceptable in polite conversation, it became firmly lodged in the new nation's soul-searching. Already in the mid-19th century, there is a strong polarity established among intellectual circles, not just historiographic. Without denying the nation's roots in ancient times, without emphatically or vehemently denying them anyway, new schools of thought built on the affinity of the new Greeks to their more recent ancestors rather than the old ones. Emblematic of the school was preference for the word Romnios, Roman for Greek. As I was growing up, again, lot later than that, I remember frequent friends of my parents saying of a Greek, is he one of us? Is he a Romnios? I'm not a Greek. Also, in typical Romantic fashion, national essence was found to reside in folk culture. So, Byzantium and folk culture went together, gradually folk culture replacing Byzantium in importance. Ancient Greece versus Byzantium and folk culture. Already here we have a rift. Ancient Greece versus Byzantium and folk culture, Hellenism versus Romiosini, and like all historical polarities, this one can be associated with a constellation of further polarities that it lives with. Bourgeois versus rural, highbrow versus lowbrow, cosmopolitan versus provincial, and so on. And there's a whole constellation of further polarities. Now, viewed in the terms of the history of ideas of the 18th and 19th centuries, these can all be read as operating in the light of another, more basic polarity, which is, of course, Enlightenment versus Romanticism. I'm speaking schematically here, and so the two sides of such opposite pairs, as also Enlightenment and Romanticism, are not always clear-cut, as cultural historians know too well. They are not totally distinct. There's often the elements sometimes interact positively, cooperate, even merge in the views of certain people. But I repeat that I sacrifice detail and often even accuracy in the name of giving a larger picture. I'm not so good on trees, I hope I'm better on forests. Now, in the era of European nationalism, historical origin hunting prevailed. In Greece, however, this was complicated by a living organism that both united and separated from old from new. I will not presume to lecture on the glossiko zitema, the issue of language, especially not with Peter Mackridge in the room. But a few points are necessary. Here are two of the most emblematic figures of the two sides, Korais and Psycharis, both visionaries motivated by ideology. The first believed in making the living language kathareus, or purist, with powerful infusions from Attic Greek. The other went for an extreme demotiki, borrowing from and collating idioms, banishing archaisms, with a vehemence that the Académie Française once banished Americanisms. Speaking of the Académie Française, incidentally, what united Korais and Psycharis was that both of them created a new language for the Greeks in Paris. One cannot look at self-images of modern Greece, perhaps in this day and age I should call them selfies, by sidestepping the glossiko, which is very much about essence. Is the new Greece a continuation of the ancient, or an emanation of a romantic, folkish idea? As far as the elite culture went, the glossiko was overcome creatively only in literature. The greater the literature, the more successful the overcome. The Greek national poet, Dionysios Solomos, writing in demotic idiom, created a language that is beautiful, highly expressive, and conceptually rich. Or Alexandros Papadiamantis, who, writing in a form of katharevousa, reverted to everyday speech and dialect in the dialogues of his characters, giving modern Greek a full range of expressive possibilities. But, unfortunately, Shelley was wrong in this case. The poets were not the unacknowledged legislators of modern Greece. The politicians were. The glossiko is about simplification, of course, about standardization. But it is also about intervention. The intervention first of intellectuals and then, more ominously, of the politicians and the state. And so the polarity inherent in it soon became a battle, often not just of words. From the start, the ancient Greece versus Byzantium folk culture had strong political and social undertones, with the concomitant polarities of bourgeois versus rural, middle class versus working class, and so on. These became stronger when the polarity was dominated by the glossiko. But then the plot thickens. The adoption of the motiki by the left and the persecutions against the Communist Party in the late 1920s drive the two sides further apart. In fact, eventually politics came down on the cultural rift in a way reminiscent of the old Monty Python cartoons. Political passions in the entre-deux-guerres and the Cold War were much stronger than any historiographical or linguistic squabbles. The ancient Greece versus folk culture antagonism was dominated now by politics, and politics spoke in a much louder voice than that of any intellectual or literary debate. The dictatorship of Ioannis Metaxas, 1936-41, attempted to fund what he calls the Third Hellenic Civilization, modeled quite obviously on the Third Reich. The proponent of the demotiki in education, that was his focus side, Metaxas went to ancient Greece for ideological origin stories, as was to be expected. Not surprisingly, this model was Sparta and not Athens, and of course there are echoes of Metaxas. In fact, Metaxas hated the Athenian ideal so much that he had outlawed Pericles' funeral speech, that part from Thucydides' history. And of course there are echoes of Metaxas narratives in the propaganda of Golden Dawn today. The colonel's dictatorship, 67-74, in its huge feast of the military virtue of the Greeks in the Athens Stadium, used mythology as well as history. Incidentally, the Greek film director Tassos Voulmetis has made the junta's feast an interesting part of his young protagonist's upbringing in his latest film, Mythopath. And must also add here that the colonels did not create those historical reenactments out of thin air. Jessica Kourniakti, in her thesis, has shown that these are a continuation of the feast commemorating the nationalist victory against the communists in the Civil War. This kind of kitsch has great staying power, surviving, for example, in this year's feasts at Salamis. A university student at the time of the dictatorship, as also educated Greeks now in their 20s or 30s, can brush off such displays as combinations of reactionary ideology and bad aesthetics. But I think it's more complicated than that. It's to miss their motivation. At this level of individuals, at the level of individual psychology, we move from the large scale, the social, to the personal. Grandiose imaginings are defensive reactions to an overwhelming reality. The same is true at the level of the group, or the nation. The appeal to ancient glory in modern Greece should be read in this context along the lines of the emblematic expression of Greek personal narcissism, embodied in the phrase, "Ξέρεις ποιος είμαι εγώ ρε?" Literally, do you know who I am, or more correctly, do you know who you're talking to? Here is an early example of this, a sad example, exhibiting the underlying root of megalomania in defense. An Athens demonstration of the mid-1950s in support of the ochre struggle in Cyprus. Alongside the oft-repeated "Long live the Union," Enosis, we see the assertion, when the English were living in hovels, the Greeks were building Parthenons. It is clear that in the protesters' minds, the Greeks demonstrating and those building Parthenons were the same. I spoke before of variants of Genos as a unifying theme of some fairly benign versions of the tyranny of Greeks over Greeks. But I believe that Genos also explains the more unpleasant forms in the modern Greek relationship to ancient Greece. And perhaps more contentiously, I claim that Genos also explains the rejection of ancient Greece. At the roots of those pathologies is conflict, external and internal. One kind we saw, how aggression, or what is perceived as aggression, drives defense. We have outside looking in and inside looking in, camera view and mirror view conflicts that drive those familial pathologies. The external conflict goes back to what I call, for simplicity, the Byron-Falmerai polarity. Here it is, again, encapsulated in an interesting mix of picture and words, again from the Frankfurter Allgemeine. The sad expression of my compatriot, the heart with the Greek flag, the necessary element of kitsch, the message, ακόμα σ' αγαπάω, I still love you, the insider's melancholy. And then the outsider's question, what should I learn to understand Greece, ancient or modern Greek? The way the question is phrased, incidentally, is pure paradox. The answer, of course, is ancient. If I was a Zen master leading you to the deeper meaning of Greece today, I would give you this slide as a koan and let you meditate on it for about 10 years. This is a rough timeline of the long 20th century in Greece, from the end of the Civil War until the rise to power of PASOK in 1981. The internal conflict leading to the present-day pathological varieties of the Genos metaphor takes its root mostly here. Okay, so we have the Agamemnon catastrophe in 1922, First Greek Republic until 1935, Metaxas dictatorship, the Civil War. That's the left-hand timeline, very rough. On the right, you see reflections in the Glossiko. Glossiko begins to be politicized after 22. 50, the dissonance appears in the sense that it is Katharevousa is taught in the schools strongly and with many teaching hours and with great strictness, as is ancient Greek, whereas the people are increasingly, the students and their parents are increasingly speaking, rather speaking Demotic as they were, but increasingly seeing the dissonance. Demotic becomes an official language briefly for a year in 64. That is half retracted in 65, then 67 there's full retraction. I should tell you that I happen to be a primary student, school, and then early upper school student in exactly those years. So we're taught Katharevousa until 64. Demotiki 64 to 65, half Demotiki, half Katharevousa 65 to 67, full Katharevousa 67. So that is new. And it can create deep traumas, but it's serious. It's more serious than that. As you see, the brunt of the conflict is borne by the Glossiko. Already in the 50s, the vast majority of Greek intellectuals, poets, and writers had switched to Demotiki. Demotiki ruled everywhere, except that is in state documents, courts, and much more importantly in education. The distance between the language young people were forced to study and the one they spoke and read fostered resentment of the whole world of symbols, and with them, the dominant version of antiquity. When the junta took over the state in 67, appointing itself as guardian of everything Hellenic, including language and history, it added insult to injury, to dissonance, repression. In his work on civil wars, political scientist Stathis Kalivas, in fact he explained this here a few weeks ago, has proposed a model according to which violence is worst not when one side fully dominates the other, not even where there is a balance of power, but where there is what he calls hegemonic dominance, or I quote, when one side exercises hegemonic, though not total control. This is clearly the case in the cultural war taking place during this period. The state, with Katharevousa's flagship, has hegemonic control on citizens' minds, so resentment abounds. When post-dictatorship, the educationally oppressed generations of the Cold War came into positions of power, the hegemony was reversed. Yesterday's oppressed became today's rulers. Resentment made a 180-degree turn. To understand my point on what happened post-dictatorship, we can see katharevousa and with it certain ideas of ancient Greece as water, bath water to be exact. When members of the new elites turned against these ideas, they were not too attentive of what the bath water contained. The British psychoanalyst John Riviere once made the notorious statement that socialism is the religion of younger siblings. I don't know about that, but revolt against the status quo frequently is. The rebellious young brother, Abel turning Cain, the essence of this imagined relationship is denial. Denial of the ancient. The imagined relationship is, I believe, at the root of the cultural, institutional, and imagined life of post-dictatorship Greece. And it deserves a whole lecture or a series of lectures to itself. I'll have to restrict myself to 2 minutes to mention only some of the political actions that gave it form. 3 years after the collapse of the dictatorship, the Monarchy was made the official language of education, and the state, the center-right, by the state, the center-right, New Democracy. Then, under center-left wing PASOK, or left wing if you believe what the wrong statements were at the time, a series of political decisions were implemented which were a clear case of overreaction. The bath water had been thrown out already, remember. Now the baby followed, and then more and more water was thrown over it, all but drowning. The most marked of those decisions were, first, the establishment of the monotonic system in writing, abolishing diacritics. Second, the discontinuation of the teaching of ancient Greek in schools, lasted 6 years, but the mark was made. The third decision was not seen as important at the time, and its mention will only be greeted by an indifferent shrug today, but not in this room, not in this building, I hope. I think rather, I know. In 1982, the director of the Greek National Theatre, as well as over 20 of its leading actors, were fired, and the contracts of many other artists were discontinued. The official explanation was that renewal was necessary. The unofficial that they were considered right-wing. The very real effect, however, was that a constantly evolving tradition of 40+ years in the performance of ancient drama was abruptly interrupted. One might counteract here that those decisions were without serious consequence, since A, the Demotiki was already the national language for all practical purposes, since B, the polytonic system had no more substantial phonetic, semantic, or grammatical value, since C, the teaching of ancient Greek, as practiced by the school system until then was sheer drudgery, and finally, D, since the performances of ancient drama were seen by a fairly small number of Greeks. There is a dose of truth in each objection. However, their collective effect delivered a coup de grâce to most of the continuing echoes of ancient Greece in the country. In a society afflicted by discontinuity, those were 4 discontinuities too many. The loss was more than symbolic, though an attempt at symbolic compensation was made, perhaps in reaction, self-conscious, who knows, guilt. The government in which implemented the full-scale attack, I can find no better word, on some of the most important survivals of ancient Greek culture, was the first to make a major issue of the return of the Elgin marbles. The great painter Yannis Tsarouchis, and also our greatest modern wit, our sort of Bernard Shaw, Oscar Wilde, and Mark Twain rolled into one, was seen by a friend in Athens airport a few days after Melina Mercouri, then Minister of Culture, had declared war on the British Museum. "Where are you going, Yanni?" his friend asked. "London," said Tsarouchis. "Is it a matter of health?" the friend asked anxiously. "Are you well? Going to see a specialist?" Tsarouchis was rather ill at the time. No, I'm fine," Tsarouchis said. "I just want to see the Elgin marbles before Melina takes them away from us." This story is another koan I will give my disciples to contemplate on when I become a Zen master. It must be added that the role of rebellious younger brother is not exercised only by the state in post-dictatorship Greece. You find its advocates everywhere, in everyday conversations, in the press, in academia. In this period, for example, a new derogatory term was fabricated, Hellenocentric, to marginalize as intellectual pariahs intellectuals who think that certain traditions have no value except as that certain traditions should have more value than as fodder for deconstruction. Of course, people must deconstruct all they want, those that want to. But again, I'm thinking babies and bathwater. Again, I'm thinking, and this is a dominant motif of the modern Greek mindset, that we have moved from one extreme to the other. In the wake of the younger brother's rebellion, there followed three more familial pathologies. The first was definitely the most benign. The ancient Greeks, as our great-great-great-grandfathers, I mean intellectual, not genetic. You see here pictures from another feast in the stadium, the opening ceremony of the 2024 Athens Olympics, to many the heyday of post-dictatorship Greece. Unlike the pageants of the Colonel's Junta, the feasts organized by Dimitri Papaioannou were in good taste. Please note that the subjects are taken exclusively from mythology, not history. There is also expedience in this, of course. After all, Iran also takes place in the Olympics, as does Turkey, and it won't do to show them scenes of our glorious ancestors slaughtering their glorious ancestors. But there is more here, I think. Unlike Greece's history, its mythology is now shared by Greek and non-Greek alike. Archetypes and Jung and even Disney have made the Greek myth part of a common legacy of all educated or not so educated folk. As globalization proceeded and Greece became speedily more European and international, good things of course, younger generations began more and more to see what older generations saw as their legacy, now as common human legacy. They began to see the islands of the Aegean more and more as their friends from the States, England or Germany saw them when they came in the summer. Young children grew to see Hercules as the peer not just of Theseus, but of Batman. This is the form of denial adapted to the eternal spring of pre-crisis Greece, benign denial, which incidentally also comes in handy for the transformation of the country into a commodity and the concomitant change in essence. The eternal spring of pre-crisis Greece was sadly not eternal. New mushrooms sprouted. The two latest and most unpleasant species have grown on the ground ravaged by fratricide. You can call it parasite too if you're a good Freudian. If the fratricidal pathology hates and destroys, the newer varieties exhibit pathological love, the kind of loving a country best does without. Both of those varieties of imagined familial relations are mutants, created from defensive motifs appearing in the 19th and 20th centuries, combined with new varieties of dissatisfaction. The single-child relationship was first given succinct expression by this man. For those of you that don't recognize him, maybe he's the same as the one played by Jean-Louis Trintignant in Kostas Gavras' Z. Christos Azetakis, as president of the Greek Republic in the late 1980s, declared officially that we are ethnos another, a nation without siblings. Here you have the metaphor from official lips. By the way, good story, Kostas Gavras, when I met him quite late, met him 10 years ago, and when I met him for the first time we spoke, I told him I'm a big fan and so on, so I said, Costa, you know, you are such a great man, you have done Greece so much good, I love your films, I love your work, you know, what you usually tell people you admire, and you have done Greece the greatest good, and perhaps a little tiny bad thing. And he said, yes, yes, I know, Sargetakis. It was said at the time when Sargetakis was made president of the Republic that had there not been the Gavras film, which made him world famous and Greek famous again, that he probably wouldn't have been chosen. It's probably true. The essence of Greece as siblingless state is clearly enough isolation. By the way, I tend to read Yorgos Lanthimos' film Dogtooth, with its images of a family cut off from the world, as somewhat of an allegory of this. But once a nation feels isolated, another form, it is a natural reaction to jump back in history to find worthy siblings. This move fueled the most noxious form of family pathology, which is that of the spoiled child. The single child became the spoiled child. The most extreme of defensive reactions. In the case of the Cyprus liberation struggle, we saw this as tragedy. Here are something less sublime. Please note the importance, this is a golden dawn supporter, please note the importance of the little word we, which leads us directly to the essence of this pathology as entitled. And here we have come full circle from Hierostathis and its puritanical, old-fashioned essence of discipleship with its implied imperative to the modern Greeks, learn from the ancients. We have moved in the past decades, in fact, from denial, benign or defensive, to a pathological regression which goes hand in hand with the anti-Western, anti-European feelings which form the breeding ground of the neo-Nazi party, and not just it. As a Greek, I believe that the only harm we do in this movement is to ourselves. I have said, as I have announced, some unpleasant things about the state of Greece, but even when I did so, or perhaps especially, I was motivated by love of it. So I cannot finish this talk in the mode of Cassandra. What I can say regarding the future cannot be descriptive. The Tiresias mode exists only in art. So, as I dare not use the word prescriptive, I'll call it dreaming. But it is dreaming starting from real tendencies in modern Greek society, real persons and ideas that give reasons for real hope. I spoke of the tyranny of Greece over Greece as a series of distorting mirrors in which modern Greeks see themselves, the distortions, determined by the idea of genos and creating those imagined familial relationships. To abolish the tyranny, we have to transform the idea behind it. To abolish the tyranny, we have to abolish the metaphor or leave it behind us. But what will take its part? It can't be the eros that Butler finds in the tyranny of Greeks over Germany. We are too old for that. What then? I propose that this new idea should be philia. It does not escape me, of course, that philia and Hellas together lead to philhellenism, historically a Cameroon phenomenon. But there is no inherent reason, no inherent linguistic reason, why such combination cannot also apply to the mirror view. The mirror view of a people whose language has evolved continuously from an older one, who inhabit the same old lands and possibly, with the influence of language, geography, or God knows what, share some of the cultural or possibly also character traits of the older people. Eros is involuntary and genos is inherited, not so philia. If today's Greeks want to change their relationship to ancient Greece, we can only do so through voluntary creative acts. The good news is that we can build on precedent. For I believe, at least, that what is best in modern Greece's relationship with ancient Greece was achieved until now by creative individuals and groups, by certain modern Greek poets and writers, by certain modern Greek visionaries and scholars and thinkers, by certain modern Greek painters and architects, by certain modern Greek musicians, theater and film directors and choreographers. And of course, all of the above couldn't have been done also without people of the mirror view. People of the mirror view couldn't work except with the people of the camera view. They benefit immensely from certain people of the camera view, the non-Greek friends of Greece, either through dialogue or collaboration. And my slide, of course, does not begin to do justice to the extent of this latter. I'm speaking today at the invitation of the Archive of Performances of Greek and Roman drama. So, I have to assure you that my final remarks serve a nobler purpose than to ingratiate myself with my kind hosts. They grow out of the belief that we have no greater examples of the true philia of modern Greece to the old, and very few things that are its equal, than the tradition of performance of Greek drama that started in the 1930s, by the National Theatre first, and continued until the 70s, masterminded by some of modern Greece's greatest artists. The start was made by the National Theatre. The tradition continuing until it was broken by government decree. This is the same tradition, incidentally, that is mentioned by Oliver Tapion as formative in Greek tragedy in action and elsewhere. In the late 1950s and 1960s, this tradition was enriched by the extraordinary performances of the Greek art theater of Carlos Koun, of the birds, the frogs, the Persians, and Oedipus Rex. He worked with some of Greece's greatest artists, again among them Tsarouchis, in stage design and Hatzidakis in music. There is something in the performance of an old work in a new age that makes it the paragon of cultural dialogue. And so there is something which makes performance of old works the acid test for how one culture relates to another. Between slavishly imitating the old, or rather trying to imitate it, as imitation across millennia is bound to fail, and between that and actively offending it by imposing on it our own preoccupations and norms to an extent that obliterates meaning, there is the middle road. Not the middle road of weakness, but of creativity. Not the middle road of compromise, but of wisdom. Between regression and destruction, between the blindness of a certain kind of eros and the pathologies of a certain idea of genos, between tyranny and denial, there lies the beautiful pasture of philia. Please look at this picture, my third and final koan. It's from the Art Theatre's performance of the Persians in the 60s. Rather than imitate what it depicts, a society kneeling in fear and awe as before a despot, before the ghost of a long-gone patriarch, we should strive to be inspired by the creative imagination that lets such images come to life. Thank you.